The summer of 2008 in Orlando, Florida, began like any other. Humid afternoons, children playing in quiet suburban neighborhoods, and families preparing for the 4th of July. But in one home, behind closed doors, a story was unfolding that would soon grip the nation. A 2-year-old girl vanished, and her absence would go unnoticed publicly for more than a month. During those 31 days, her young mother offered excuses, fabricated stories, and lived a life that seemed entirely disconnected from the gravity of what had happened. Investigators would later uncover a trail of deception, a family in turmoil, and a case that tested the very boundaries of reasonable doubt in the American justice system. By the time the truth came into the public eye, the world wasn't just following a criminal investigation. It was witnessing one of the most divisive trials in modern history. And this is the story of Caylee Anthony, the mother who partied for 31 days while her daughter was missing. If you want more deep dives into the cases that shocked the world, subscribe now to Eternal Obsidian, where crime is remembered, dissected, and never forgotten. In the quiet neighborhoods of Orlando, Florida, the Anthony family lived an ordinary suburban life. George and Cindy Anthony worked steady jobs and raised their granddaughter, Caylee Marie, alongside their daughter Caylee. Caylee was a bright 2-year-old with a warm smile, known for her boundless energy and curiosity. To neighbors and extended family, she was the center of attention in the Anthony household, often seen playing in the yard, swimming in the family pool, or clinging to her mother. But beneath that appearance of normalcy, tension had long existed in the Anthony family. Caylee, though only 22 years old in 2008, already had a reputation for avoiding responsibility and telling stories that didn't always add up. She had moved in and out of jobs, and her relationship with her parents, especially her mother, was complicated. Cindy shouldered much of the responsibility for Caylee's care, while George tried to balance family loyalty with his own frustrations. Yet, like many families, they maintained the fragile structure of home life around a child they all adored. June 16, 2008, became the last day Caylee was seen alive. That morning, Caylee left the Anthony home with her daughter. George Anthony, who was home at the time, later testified that he saw them leave together. Caylee, wearing a bright red shirt, kissed her grandfather goodbye and walked out with her mother. What followed from that moment remains at the center of years of speculation, investigation, and legal battles. From that day forward, Caylee vanished. For the next 31 days, Caylee Anthony concealed her daughter's absence. Instead of alerting her family or contacting the police, she created a web of deception. She told her parents and friends that Caylee was with a nanny, a woman she called Zani. She said she was busy working at Universal Studios, a job she no longer held but pretended to maintain. She moved between friends' apartments, spent nights with her boyfriend, and appeared in photographs at parties. To those who saw her, Caylee appeared carefree, as though life continued normally. At home, however, Cindy Anthony began pressing for answers. She repeatedly asked her daughter to bring Caylee over, wanting to see her granddaughter. Each time, Caylee deflected. Caylee was with Zani, or she was at the beach, or she was visiting with friends. Cindy's suspicions grew, but she accepted her daughter's explanations, at least on the surface. The Anthony family dynamic was marked by tension and denial, and Caylee's fabrications slipped by longer than most would expect. The truth began to unravel in mid-July. On July 15th, George and Cindy retrieved Caylee's white Pontiac Sunfire from a tow yard after it had been abandoned. When they opened the trunk, both later said the smell inside was overwhelming. George, a former law enforcement officer, immediately thought it resembled the odor of human decomposition. Cindy told the tow yard employee that it smelled like a dead body had been in the car. Alongside the stench, they found a trash bag filled with discarded food, but the odor seemed stronger than garbage alone. That evening, the family confrontation escalated. Cindy demanded to see her granddaughter and pressed Caylee for answers. Caylee maintained her story that Caylee was with the nanny, but the lies crumbled. Cindy placed a series of frantic 911 calls. In one, she reported that her granddaughter had been missing for a month and that her daughter had lied about her whereabouts. In another, She said her daughter's car smelled like there had been a dead body inside. The dispatcher alerted law enforcement, and the case that would soon grip the nation officially began. When law enforcement responded to the Anthony home on the night of July 15, 2008, they were met with a swirl of panic, contradictions, and suspicion. Officers with the Orange County Sheriff's Office began by speaking with Caylee herself. To them, she appeared calm, almost detached, even as her mother's frantic 911 calls echoed in the background. Caylee explained that Caylee had been missing for weeks, taken by a nanny she referred to as Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, or Zani. She told investigators that she had been conducting her own search for Caylee, too frightened to alert the police sooner. She described Zenaida in detail, offering an apartment address and even the claim that this woman had worked as Caylee's babysitter for years. The story sounded practiced, as if it had been rehearsed, but it began to crumble under scrutiny almost immediately. Detectives quickly checked the apartment address Caylee provided. The unit had been vacant for months. They contacted the management office and verified that no one by the name of Zenaida Gonzalez had ever lived there. This was the first clear signal that Caylee's account could not be trusted, but investigators pressed forward carefully, not wanting to lose any chance of locating Caylee alive. In the early hours of July 16th, Caylee agreed to take police to her workplace. She insisted that she was employed at Universal Studios and that she could introduce detectives to co-workers who had seen her with Caylee in recent weeks. Investigators followed her through the gates, into the main buildings, and down a hallway, but the ruse collapsed when she stopped, turned, and admitted she did not actually work there. She had not been employed by Universal for years. The detectives noted this as one more fabrication, and her credibility began to unravel in real time. Meanwhile, George and Cindy Anthony gave statements of their own. Cindy reiterated her concern about the smell in Caylee's car, describing it as like nothing she had ever encountered before. George, drawing on his background in law enforcement, told detectives the odor reminded him of human decomposition. Crime scene technicians processed the Pontiac Sunfire, documenting stains and sending air samples for testing. Though results would take weeks, the initial impression left a chilling mark on the investigation, the possibility that Caylee might not be alive. Over the next several days, detectives traced Caylee's movements during the 31-day period since Caylee was last seen. They discovered that she had been living with her boyfriend, Tony Lazaro, much of the time going out to clubs and spending time with friends. Party photographs surfaced, showing Caylee smiling and dancing, even as her daughter's whereabouts remained unaccounted for. To investigators and, soon after, the public, the images stood in stark contrast to the picture of a mother searching desperately for a missing child. Still, Caylee stuck to her story about Zani the nanny. She insisted Caylee was alive, that she was doing everything she could to get her back, and that she feared for her daughter's safety if she involved the authorities too soon. Each new interview, however, revealed more contradictions. She named friends and co-workers who could corroborate her story, but when detectives followed up, those individuals said they had no knowledge of the babysitter, no recent contact with Caylee, and no idea what Caylee was talking about. On July 16th, Caylee was arrested for the first time. The charges were not for her daughter's disappearance but for child neglect, making false statements and obstructing a criminal investigation. She was booked into the Orange County Jail, while detectives emphasized that their top priority remained locating Caylee. In court, prosecutors described her as a mother who had lied to police and misled the investigation from the very beginning. Her bond was set, but the case had already begun to attract public attention. Media outlets in Orlando quickly picked up the story, airing footage of the Anthony home, the impound lot where the Pontiac had been stored, and snippets of Cindy's emotional 911 calls. Local coverage soon expanded nationally, as the unusual nature of the case, 31 days without a missing child being reported, the bizarre story of a nanny who did not exist, and the photographs of a young mother partying during the search captivated audiences. Viewers debated whether Caylee was a scared young woman caught in a nightmare or a liar hiding something much darker. As the search for Caylee intensified, hundreds of tips poured into law enforcement. People claimed sightings of the little girl in shopping centers, at rest stops, even in other states. Each tip was logged and investigated, but none provided solid leads. volunteers joined organized searches, combing fields, wooded areas, and lakes around Orlando. For weeks, the hope remained that Caylee might still be found alive, despite the troubling signs. Behind the scenes, forensic testing on Casey's car progressed. Specialists examined the air samples, detecting chemical compounds consistent with human decomposition. A hair strand recovered from the trunk displayed characteristics often associated with post-mortem changes. These results did not provide absolute proof of a body having been in the car, but combined with the odor both George and Cindy described, they strengthened the suspicions that Caylee might not simply be missing, but dead. The tension between appearances and evidence deepened. Casey's insistence on the nanny story continued, yet every element of it failed to check out. Friends she named as witnesses denied knowledge. Employers she referenced said she had not worked for them in years. The apartment she cited was empty. The lies piled up, and with them grew the suspicion that Caylee was not merely concealing her daughter's location but obstructing justice at every turn. By the end of July 2008, the case was no longer just a local mystery. National cable networks, talk shows, and news magazines seized upon it. The face of Caylee Anthony, smiling wide-eyed, framed in snapshots of a happy toddler, became instantly recognizable across the country. And the central question, asked by investigators, neighbors, and millions of strangers, lingered. Where was Caylee? Caylee Anthony remained in jail as July gave way to August, her face now a familiar image on every news channel. Crowds gathered outside the Orange County Jail, chanting and waving signs, some demanding justice for Caylee, others voicing anger at Casey's demeanor and the bizarre explanations she had given investigators. The courtroom hearings were broadcast live, drawing viewers far beyond Florida. For many, this was their first introduction to a case that would dominate headlines for the next 3 years. On August 21, 2008, Caylee was released on bond after a California bail bondsman, Leonard Padilla, and his nephew, Tony Padilla, stepped in to post the required amount. They made it clear that their motivation was not sympathy for Caylee, but rather an interest in locating Caylee. Leonard Padilla told the press he believed Caylee knew more than she was saying, and that putting her back into the public might pressure her into talking. The decision was controversial, sparking outrage among many who felt Caylee should not have been freed while her daughter was still missing. During this period, the Anthony family household became a constant media spectacle. News vans lined the suburban street. Protesters shouted from sidewalks, accusing Caylee of murder and demanding the truth. Neighbors complained about the circus-like atmosphere, but the case had gripped the nation in a way few missing child cases ever had. The contrast between the innocent face of 2-year-old Caylee and the increasingly tangled web of Caylee's lies fueled endless debate. Inside the Anthony home, tensions ran high. Cindy Anthony defended her daughter publicly, appearing on television to insist that Caylee was alive and that the family believed she would return. George Anthony, though supportive of the search, sometimes appeared visibly shaken, his earlier statement about the smell in Caylee's car lingering in the background. Family unity was strained by the scrutiny of cameras, investigators, and public opinion. Meanwhile, law enforcement pressed ahead with a massive search. Texas EquuSearch, a volunteer organization specializing in large-scale recovery efforts, joined the effort in August 2008. Hundreds of volunteers scoured wooded areas, swamps, and fields around Orlando. Despite the intense heat and challenging terrain, the searchers persisted for days at a time. Divers checked nearby ponds and retention basins. Helicopters scanned overhead. Yet Caylee remained missing, and every lead investigators chased fell apart. Behind the scenes, forensic evidence continued to mount. The hair recovered from the trunk of Caylee's car underwent mitochondrial DNA testing, which confirmed it was consistent with Caylee's maternal line. While not absolute proof, experts testified that the hair had a banding pattern strongly associated with decomposition. Additional chemical analysis revealed compounds like chloroform in higher than normal concentrations. These findings painted an increasingly grim picture, though prosecutors and detectives still lacked the most critical piece: Caylee's body. Public frustration grew with each passing week. Commentators on television dissected every scrap of evidence, from Casey's text messages to her party photographs. Internet forums dedicated entire threads to the case, analyzing Casey's behavior and speculating on her motives. Many were outraged that a mother could go out dancing, smiling, and seemingly carefree while her daughter was missing. To others, the case was proof of a deeper dysfunction inside the Anthony family that outsiders could never fully understand. By mid-August, the pressure on Casey intensified. At one point, her bond conditions required her to stay at home with an electronic monitoring device. But she continued to deflect questions about Caylee, repeating the nanny story despite its collapse under investigation. Detectives pressed her repeatedly, but every time they hit the same wall of fabrications. The legal situation grew more serious in October 2008. A grand jury convened and, on October 14th, issued an indictment charging Caylee Anthony with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. She was taken back into custody, this time without the option of bond. It marked the beginning of what would become one of the most watched criminal trials in American history. The indictment was a turning point. Prosecutors now signaled their belief that Caylee was no longer alive and that her mother was directly responsible. For the Anthony family, it was another fracture in an already fragile situation. Cindy and George stood by their daughter publicly, but the narrative was becoming harder to defend as forensic evidence piled up. Caylee was still missing, and the world was demanding answers. As the fall of 2008 turned into winter, investigators faced a chilling question. If Caylee was dead, where was her body? By December 2008, nearly 6 months had passed since Caylee Anthony was last seen alive. The search had grown colder, and though volunteers still combed through wooded areas and wetlands, many feared the outcome was inevitable. The Anthony family clung to hope in public, giving interviews that suggested Caylee might still be alive somewhere. But inside the Orange County Sheriff's Office, investigators were preparing for the possibility that they were no longer dealing with a missing child case but a homicide. On the morning of December 11, 2008, a significant break came unexpectedly. Roy Kronk, a county meter reader, was working along Suburban Drive, a wooded area less than half a mile from the Anthony family home. Kronk had walked that stretch of road before, and months earlier he had even called authorities to report something suspicious in the same area, though at the time nothing had come of it. That day, as he pushed deeper into the brush, he spotted what looked like a small bag. Upon closer inspection, he noticed a skull nearby. Alarmed, Kronk immediately contacted law enforcement. Detectives rushed to the scene. What they found confirmed the worst fears. Skeletal remains, later identified as belonging to Caylee Anthony, were located in a wooded, swampy lot. The skull had duct tape attached, and the bones were scattered across the ground, consistent with animal activity. The discovery was grim, but it provided investigators with the evidence they had been missing for months. The area where the remains were found quickly became the focus of forensic teams. The ground was carefully sifted, and items were collected. A child's blanket, a small laundry bag, and the duct tape that had been around the skull. Each item was bagged as evidence, and the scene was documented meticulously. For investigators and prosecutors, this was the moment that transformed the case from circumstantial theory to tangible proof. For the public, it was a devastating confirmation that the little girl whose smile had become a national symbol of innocence was no longer alive. News of the discovery spread within hours, with helicopters capturing aerial footage of the wooded area. Crowds gathered outside the Anthony home, some mourning, others shouting angrily at the family. National media outlets broke into programming to cover the development live. Many commentators noted the proximity of the remains to the Anthony household, suggesting that the answer had been close all along. The Anthony family's reaction was immediate and emotional. George and Cindy released a statement through their attorney expressing their devastation but continued to support Caylee. They maintained hope that the legal process would prove her innocence. But the discovery of Caylee's remains fundamentally altered the tone of the case. It was no longer a search for a missing child. It was now a murder trial waiting to happen. Forensic experts began their analysis almost immediately. The medical examiner concluded that the remains were those of Caylee Anthony, confirmed through DNA testing. The official cause of death was listed as homicide by undetermined means. The duct tape became a central piece of evidence, with the prosecution arguing later that it had been used to suffocate Caylee. However, because the body was skeletal, no definitive mechanism of death could be established. The uncertainty of the cause of death would become a key factor in the trial years later. The prosecution believed the circumstantial evidence. The duct tape, the decomposition in the car trunk, the lies Caylee had told was overwhelming. The defense would argue that without a clear medical determination, the case for first-degree murder was weak. December 2008 marked the turning point. For months, the case had been defined by speculation, missing person posters, and endless televised debates. With Caylee's remains found, the tragedy was undeniable, and the focus shifted squarely onto Caylee Anthony. Prosecutors now had to prove not just that Caylee was dead, but that her mother had intentionally caused her death. The stage was set for a trial that would become one of the most scrutinized and polarizing in modern American history. By early 2009, the discovery of Caylee Anthony's remains had shifted the case from a missing person mystery into a looming criminal trial. Prosecutors in Orange County, led by State Attorney Lawson Lamar and Assistant State Attorney Jeff Ashton, prepared for one of the most closely watched cases in decades. Caylee Anthony was already facing charges of lying to law enforcement and child neglect, but with Caylee confirmed dead, the stakes had escalated. On October 14, 2008, a grand jury had formally indicted Caylee Anthony for first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to police. The indictment was unsealed the same day, and Caylee, who had been out on bail, was arrested again and ordered held without bond. The defense team, led by Jose Baez, immediately began constructing a strategy. Baez, who had taken on the case early, understood the mountain of public suspicion already against his client. He framed the defense around the idea that the state had no direct evidence tying Caylee to Caylee's death. The remains were skeletal, the cause of death undetermined, and much of the prosecution's case relied on circumstantial connections. The smell in the car trunk, Caylee's misleading statements, and her behavior in the 31 days following June 16, 2008. The legal back and forth began almost as soon as the indictment was handed down. Baez filed numerous motions challenging the admissibility of forensic evidence. He targeted the controversial smell test used on the air samples from Caylee's Pontiac Sunfire trunk, where experts claimed to detect chemical compounds consistent with human decomposition. Baez argued this science was experimental and unreliable, urging the judge to exclude it. Similarly, he sought to block the introduction of computer search records that showed terms like chloroform and neck-breaking typed on the Anthony family's home computer. The prosecution countered with its own experts, insisting the forensic evidence was scientifically valid and crucial to proving premeditation. Judge Belvin Perry, who had been assigned to preside over the trial, was faced with the difficult task of balancing novel forensic techniques with established legal standards. Many hearings in 2009 and 2010 revolved around these scientific disputes, and each was heavily covered by the press. Meanwhile, jury selection loomed as a central challenge. The media saturation of the case made it nearly impossible to find jurors who had not already formed an opinion. Legal analysts predicted a lengthy voir dire process, where potential jurors would be questioned extensively about their knowledge of the case, their exposure to news coverage, and their ability to remain impartial. The court would later decide to bring in a jury from outside Orange County to minimize bias. The Anthony family remained in the spotlight as well. Cindy and George Anthony gave interviews that continued to draw attention. Cindy maintained public support for Caylee, insisting she could not have harmed her daughter. George, however, appeared increasingly strained, at times suggesting he doubted Caylee's version of events. Their differing tones would later play a pivotal role when the defense attempted to shift blame onto George during the trial. The media frenzy only intensified during this pretrial period. Every motion, every hearing, and every family statement was broadcast, analyzed, and dissected by cable news and legal pundits. Networks like CNN and HLN devoted extensive programming to the case, with Nancy Grace emerging as one of the most vocal commentators. condemning Caylee nightly. Social media users joined the conversation in ways that had not been seen before in a high-profile trial, turning the case into a daily public spectacle. For prosecutors, the challenge was to keep the focus on the evidence and not the theatrics. They believed the combination of Caylee's lies, the forensic findings, and her behavior in the critical 31-day period would convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. For the defense, the strategy was to exploit every weakness in the state's circumstantial case, to undermine the credibility of scientific evidence, and to offer an alternative explanation, no matter how controversial, for Caylee's death. By 2011, after years of legal maneuvering, delays, and discovery battles, the trial date was finally set. What had begun as a local missing child case had transformed into a national obsession. When jury selection began, it was clear this trial would test not only the strength of the evidence, but also the public's ability to separate fact from spectacle. The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would divide America. On May 9, 2011, nearly 3 years after Caylee Anthony had last been seen alive, jury selection for the trial of Caylee Anthony began in Pinellas County, Florida. Judge Belvin Perry, aware of the intense media coverage and the potential for bias, had ordered that the jury be selected from a different jurisdiction than Orange County, where the case originated. The panel would ultimately be sequestered for the duration of the trial to protect them from outside influence. The process of selecting 12 jurors and 5 alternates was painstaking. Each potential juror was questioned extensively about their knowledge of the case, their exposure to news coverage, and whether they could set aside preconceived notions. Many admitted to having followed the case on television or online, and those individuals were excused. After nearly 2 weeks of vetting, a jury was seated. 7 women and 5 men, with an additional 5 alternates. They were transported to Orlando, housed under guard, and instructed to avoid all media coverage. The trial opened on May 24, 2011, with packed courtrooms and live national television coverage. The prosecution, led by Jeff Ashton and Linda Drain Burdick, laid out its theory in stark terms. Caylee Anthony had killed her daughter by using chloroform to render her unconscious, and then suffocated her with duct tape placed over her nose and mouth. The motive, prosecutors argued, was that Caylee wanted freedom from the responsibilities of motherhood. They described Caylee's skeletal remains being found in December 2008, a few hundred yards from the Anthony home, with duct tape attached to the skull and hair. To the state, these details pointed unmistakably to homicide and premeditation. When it was the defense's turn, Jose Baez shocked the courtroom. In his opening statement, he declared that Caylee Anthony had not been murdered at all, that she had accidentally drowned in the family swimming pool on June 16, 2008. According to Baez, George Anthony, Caylee's father, had discovered the child, panicked, and helped dispose of the body. Baez went further, alleging years of sexual abuse by George, claims George Anthony adamantly denied. This narrative stunned both the public and the courtroom observers, as it was the first time the defense had laid out an alternative explanation for Caylee's death. The weeks that followed were filled with emotional and technical testimony. The prosecution called witnesses ranging from law enforcement officers to forensic experts. Former friends and acquaintances testified about Caylee's behavior during the 31 days when Caylee was missing, recounting her time spent partying, shopping, and socializing without mentioning her daughter. Investigators described Caylee's inconsistent stories, the fabricated nanny Zani, her supposed job at Universal Studios, and the false trails she created. Forensic specialists presented some of the most contested evidence. They testified about air samples taken from the trunk of Caylee's Pontiac Sunfire that suggested the presence of human decomposition. Others discussed hair strands with apparent postmortem banding found in the trunk, and chemical tests that pointed to chloroform. The state also introduced computer search history recovered from the Anthony home showing searches for chloroform, neck breaking, and how to make chloroform. The defense countered by attacking the credibility of the forensic science. Their experts argued that the odor in the trunk could have come from garbage, not human remains, and that the so-called post-mortem banding on the hair could not be reliably interpreted. On the computer searches, the defense highlighted discrepancies, suggesting that some of the searches may have been conducted when George Anthony, not Caylee, was home. Family testimony added further drama. Caylee Anthony testified for both the prosecution and the defense. At one point, she claimed she, not Casey, had searched for chloroform on the computer while looking up information about chlorophyll and her pets. This contradicted earlier statements and raised questions about her credibility. George Anthony, when called by the defense, firmly denied abusing Casey and rejected Baez's claims about his involvement in Caylee's death. His demeanor on the stand reflected both anger and deep grief, which some jurors later said made a strong impression. The prosecution closed its case by emphasizing the pattern of Casey's lies and her indifference to her daughter's disappearance. They argued that Casey had motive, opportunity, and means, and that the duct tape on Caylee's remains was clear proof of homicide. The defense, in turn, reminded jurors that no cause of death was ever established by the medical examiner. They urged the jury to see the case as built on speculation and unreliable forensics rather than hard evidence. By early July 2011, the trial neared its conclusion. Jurors had listened to weeks of technical testimony, emotional family conflict, and two radically different versions of what happened in the summer of 2008. The world waited for their verdict, with cameras positioned outside the courthouse and commentators debating endlessly on television. On July 4, 2011, closing arguments were delivered. The next day, the case went to the jury. After only about 11 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the panel announced they had reached a decision. On July 5, 2011, the courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Not guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and aggravated child abuse. Caylee Anthony was convicted only on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The shock was immediate. Gasps filled the courtroom, and outside, crowds of onlookers shouted in outrage. Television anchors and legal analysts expressed disbelief at the outcome, though some acknowledged that the prosecution's lack of direct evidence made the acquittal legally plausible. Casey was sentenced to 4 years in jail for the misdemeanors but was credited for time served and released later that month. The trial that had captivated the nation had ended not with closure, but with controversy that continues to this day. The verdict in Caylee Anthony's trial reverberated far beyond the walls of the Orange County Courthouse. On July 5, 2011, within minutes of the announcement, the reaction across the country was swift and polarized. Outside the courthouse, crowds that had gathered in anticipation erupted into anger. Many shouted at the cameras, holding signs that read, "Justice for Caylee" and "Baby Killer." News networks carried the reaction live, broadcasting the shock and outrage nationwide. Legal commentators, who had spent months analyzing the case, were divided. Some argued that the jury had reached the only conclusion available under the law, given the lack of direct evidence tying Caylee Anthony to her daughter's death. Others called it a miscarriage of justice, pointing to Casey's repeated lies, her month-long concealment of Caylee's disappearance, and the circumstantial evidence presented at trial. Judge Belvin Perry addressed the jurors afterward, praising them for their service. He acknowledged the case's intensity and the difficulty of their decision. Later, some jurors spoke anonymously to the media. They explained that while many felt Casey bore some responsibility, the prosecution had not proved beyond a reasonable doubt how Caylee had died or who was responsible. The absence of a confirmed cause of death was a critical factor. Several jurors described their decision as agonizing, with at least one saying they cried after the verdict was read. On July 7, 2011, Caylee Anthony was sentenced for her 4 misdemeanor convictions of providing false information to law enforcement. Judge Perry imposed the maximum sentence of 4 years in jail, along with $4,000 in fines. However, because she had already served nearly 3 years in pretrial detention and received credit for good behavior, she was set for release just 10 days later. On July 17, 2011, Caylee Anthony walked out of the Orange County Jail in the early morning hours. Wearing jeans and a pink t-shirt, she was escorted by her attorney and shielded by law enforcement as protesters shouted from behind barricades. Demonstrators waved signs and yelled insults, reflecting the widespread public anger. Caylee entered an SUV and left without disclosing her destination. For security reasons, her whereabouts were kept secret. In the weeks and months that followed, Caylee remained largely out of public view. Media outlets scrambled to track her movements, but her attorneys revealed little. Reports surfaced that she had gone into hiding, possibly staying with supporters or benefactors who helped shield her from threats. Public resentment was so intense that offers of book deals or interviews sparked outrage, and several rumored opportunities never materialized. Meanwhile, the legal fallout from the case continued. In 2012, Caylee Anthony filed for bankruptcy, citing nearly $800,000 in debts. Among the listed creditors was Zenaida Gonzalez, who had sued Caylee for defamation after Caylee falsely claimed a babysitter by that name had kidnapped Caylee. The lawsuit, which had dragged on for years, was effectively ended in 2015 when Anthony's bankruptcy filing discharged the debts, including potential liability to Gonzalez. This resolution was procedural, not a judicial finding on the merits of Gonzalez's claims, but it closed one of the case's lingering legal chapters. The aftermath also saw the birth of Caylee's Law. Across the United States, public outrage over the case fueled demands for legal reform. Petitions quickly gained millions of signatures online. Several states, including Florida, passed statutes making it a felony for a parent or guardian to fail to report the disappearance or death of a child within a reasonable period. Florida's law, enacted in 2012, required that the death of a child be reported within 48 hours and that a missing child under 16 be reported within 24 hours. The laws varied by state, but all reflected the public's desire to ensure that future cases would not follow the same path. The Anthony family, fractured by years of conflict, remained under scrutiny. George and Cindy Anthony gave occasional interviews, expressing grief for their granddaughter and mixed feelings about their daughter. George, in particular, strongly rejected the defense's claims that he had molested Caylee or helped cover up Caylee's death, calling those accusations devastating lies. Cindy maintained some contact with Caylee but acknowledged that their relationship was strained. Public opinion of Caylee Anthony remained overwhelmingly negative. Polls taken in the years after the trial consistently showed that a majority of Americans believed she was guilty despite the acquittal. Her name became synonymous with the case, and her attempts to live privately were often disrupted by renewed media interest whenever she was spotted in public. The trial's conclusion did not bring closure to the question that had haunted the case from the beginning. What exactly happened to Caylee Anthony in June 2008? With no definitive answers, the public narrative of Caylee Anthony's acquittal became one of the most controversial and divisive in American legal history. Caylee Anthony's release from jail in July 2011 marked the end of her criminal trial, but the beginning of a different kind of sentence. One lived under near constant scrutiny, suspicion, and public hostility. For months after her release, her exact whereabouts were unknown. Reporters tracked rumors of her moving between safe houses, sometimes allegedly supported by benefactors who helped her remain hidden from a public that remained furious over the verdict. Photographs of her were rare, and when they surfaced, they were often grainy tabloid shots showing her in casual clothing, attempting to live a quiet existence. The secrecy around her movements only intensified public fascination. In early 2012, Caylee filed for bankruptcy in federal court, citing approximately $792,000 in debts against less than $1,100 in assets. Among her creditors were law enforcement agencies, the IRS, her former defense attorney Jose Baez, and Zenaida Gonzalez, who had been pursuing a defamation lawsuit against her since 2008. The bankruptcy proceedings effectively halted Gonzalez's civil suit, and by 2015 the bankruptcy court had discharged Anthony's debts, ending the case not through a finding on the merits but through financial relief. Despite bankruptcy, Caylee attempted to rebuild her life. In the years following her release, she reportedly lived with members of her legal team, including private investigator Pat McKenna, who had played a central role in her defense. McKenna, who had also worked on the O.J. Simpson case, provided her with a level of protection and privacy that allowed her to avoid the constant media attention. In 2013, Caylee gave a brief video deposition in connection with the Zenaida Gonzalez lawsuit. Her appearance marked one of the first times she had spoken publicly since her trial. The deposition was widely circulated, though her answers were limited, and she revealed little about her life since her release. She also became the subject of ongoing speculation about potential media deals. Rumors swirled about possible book contracts, paid interviews, and even reality show offers. Each time such reports surfaced, backlash from the public was swift. Television networks and publishers, wary of the controversy, largely avoided giving her a platform. As a result, Anthony remained mostly silent, surfacing only rarely. Her family ties were strained but not entirely severed. Cindy Anthony occasionally acknowledged contact with her daughter, though she admitted in interviews that their relationship was far from what it once had been. George Anthony, by contrast, remained deeply bitter. He not only rejected the defense's trial accusations that he had abused Caylee, but also expressed doubt about her innocence in Caylee's death. In public appearances, he sometimes spoke of forgiveness but never of full reconciliation. In 2016, nearly 5 years after her acquittal, Caylee gave an interview to the Associated Press. Speaking from South Florida, she stated that she lived with McKenna and worked for him as a researcher. She denied involvement in Caylee's death and claimed she was still unsure what had happened to her daughter. At one point she remarked, "I don't give an expletive about what anyone thinks about me. I never will." The blunt statement reignited media coverage and public anger, underscoring how polarizing her case remained. Over time, Caylee made limited efforts to re-enter public life. She expressed interest in photography, at one point launching a small business, though it never gained traction. Later, reports emerged that she was considering telling her story in greater depth, possibly through a film or documentary. In 2022, more than a decade after her acquittal, Caylee Anthony participated in a 3-part Peacock documentary series titled Caylee Anthony, Where the Truth Lies. In her interviews, she repeated many of the claims her defense had presented at trial, including accusations that her father had abused her and had been involved in covering up Caylee's death. George Anthony, through his attorney, denied the allegations, calling them false and damaging. The documentary was widely covered in the media, with critics questioning her credibility and motives. Despite the documentary, Caylee Anthony remained largely isolated. She avoided social media and public appearances, aware that public opinion about her had not shifted. Polls conducted years after the trial showed that a majority of Americans continued to believe she was guilty, despite her legal acquittal. By the 2020s, she was living quietly in Florida, occasionally spotted in public but never fully escaping the shadow of the case. More than a decade after her trial, her name remains synonymous with controversy, and her life continued to be defined by the unanswered questions surrounding Caylee Anthony's death. The trial of Caylee Anthony did not end when the jury acquitted her in July 2011. Its cultural, legal, and media ripple effects would extend far beyond the Orlando courtroom, influencing public policy, sparking legislative action, and reshaping how high-profile cases were consumed in the digital age. In the weeks following the verdict, anger over Caylee Anthony's death and her mother's acquittal turned into a nationwide call for change. Across the country, citizens voiced frustration over the 31-day gap between Caylee's last confirmed sighting and the moment her grandmother finally called 911. Although Caylee had actively concealed her daughter's disappearance, many believed the law itself had failed to prevent such a delay. Petitions demanding reform appeared almost immediately. One online petition for what became known as Caylee's Law drew over 1.3 million signatures in less than a month. State legislatures responded quickly. By 2012, at least a dozen states introduced or passed measures criminalizing the failure of a parent or guardian to report a child missing or a child's death within a specified period. Florida's legislature passed its version, which Governor Rick Scott signed into law in April 2012. The statute, Section 787.043, made it a felony to knowingly and willfully fail to report a child under 16 as missing, or to fail to report the death of a child within a reasonable period of time. Unlike simplified public accounts, the law did not specify an exact 24 or 48-hour window, instead leaving room for prosecutorial discretion. Still, the intent was clear. Never again should a disappearance go unreported for weeks without consequence. Beyond legislation, the case left an indelible mark on the media landscape. The Anthony trial coincided with the explosive growth of Facebook, Twitter, and online news forums. While earlier cases such as O.J. Simpson's trial in the 1990s had captivated audiences through television, Caylee Anthony's story played out in real time across cable news and the digital sphere. Nancy Grace and other television personalities devoted nightly coverage to the case, but social media created a new layer of participation. Ordinary people debated evidence, tracked court filings, and shared opinions instantly, often blurring the lines between legal fact and speculation. The intensity of public engagement led some commentators to describe it as one of the defining media trials of the social media era, though not the very first. High-profile cases like the Scott Peterson trial in the early 2000s had already demonstrated the power of online communities, but the Anthony case magnified it, showing how platforms could amplify outrage and sustain attention for years. The fallout also extended to civil litigation. Zenaida Gonzalez's defamation lawsuit, sparked by Caylee's repeated use of her name when describing a fictional babysitter, lingered for years. Contrary to the impression that it was swiftly dismissed, the case wound through the courts until 2015. Its eventual end came not because of a definitive ruling in Caylee's favor, but because her 2013 bankruptcy filing discharged her financial obligations, effectively shutting down the lawsuit. For Gonzalez, the outcome left her without vindication. For Caylee, it underscored how financial strategy could shield her from long-running civil claims. The trial also highlighted ongoing debates about the role of forensic science in courtrooms. Disagreements among experts over air sample analysis from Caylee's car trunk, chloroform searches on her computer, and the reliability of human decomposition odors raised questions about the limits of cutting-edge techniques in criminal trials. Many legal analysts later pointed to the Anthony case as an example of junk science being presented to juries without sufficient consensus in the scientific community, fueling wider reform discussions. At the family level, the trial fractured the Anthonys permanently. George and Cindy Anthony became reluctant public figures, interviewed periodically but often depicted as emblematic of divided America itself, torn between grief, denial, and accusations. Cindy maintained sporadic contact with Caylee, though with tension, while George remained estranged, bitter about both the allegations made against him and the outcome of the trial. For the public, the case became shorthand for perceived injustice. Polls taken after the verdict showed that a large majority of Americans disagreed with the jury's decision. Legal experts countered that the prosecution had not met the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but this did little to sway public sentiment. For years, protests erupted when Caylee's name appeared in headlines, and online forums kept the case alive as a cautionary tale of how the legal system could diverge from popular expectation. Even as years passed, Caylee Anthony's name remained central to the case's legacy. Memorials were held on anniversaries of her death, and community groups used her story as a rallying cry for child protection laws. While Caylee Anthony moved through life in seclusion, Caylee's memory endured in the form of legislative reform and public remembrance. More than a decade after the verdict, the Caylee Anthony case remains one of the most polarizing legal sagas in American history. It occupies a unique place in the cultural memory, not only as a story of a young child's death and a controversial acquittal, but as a symbol of the clash between courtroom law and public opinion in the digital age. In the years following her acquittal, Caylee Anthony lived largely out of public view. By 2017, she gave her first in-depth interview since the trial to the Associated Press, declaring that she still lived in Florida and that she sleeps pretty good at night. Her comments reignited public anger, as many perceived them as callous in light of her daughter's death. That same year, defense attorney Jose Baez published a memoir recounting his version of the trial, defending his strategy and emphasizing that reasonable doubt, not sympathy for his client, carried the jury to its decision. Media outlets continued to revisit the case, especially on milestone anniversaries. Documentaries by networks such as A&E, Investigation Discovery, and Peacock sought to re-examine evidence, explore alternate theories, and profile jurors who had faced intense backlash after the verdict. Jurors themselves later described feeling vilified by the public, with some saying they went into hiding due to death threats. Their accounts underscored the gulf between the legal process, which required proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and the visceral emotions of a national audience convinced of guilt. The case also reshaped true crime media. By the mid-2010s, streaming platforms and cable networks had transformed the genre into a cultural force, often citing the Caylee Anthony trial as a turning point in public appetite for wall-to-wall coverage. In many ways, it laid the groundwork for later media frenzies surrounding cases like Jodi Arias and Chris Watts, where social media speculation merged with traditional reporting. Academically, the case became a staple in law schools and criminal justice courses. Professors used it to illustrate the tension between circumstantial evidence and reasonable doubt, the challenges of relying on forensic techniques without broad scientific consensus, and the role of jury psychology in high-profile cases. The air sample analysis, chloroform search history, and decomposition odor testimony remained case studies in debates about admissibility and scientific rigor. Legislatively, Caylee's law represented the most tangible outcome. Though statutes varied by state, the principle that parents or guardians have a clear legal duty to promptly report missing or deceased children became widely accepted. While critics noted that such laws would not necessarily have changed the outcome in Caylee's case, the legislation reflected a powerful public desire to ensure no child's disappearance went unreported again. Culturally, Caylee Anthony became a lasting symbol. Memorials in Orlando and beyond marked her life, and her name often appeared in advocacy for child welfare. In contrast, Caylee's name became shorthand in popular discourse for a perceived miscarriage of justice. References to her surfaced in television shows, late-night comedy, and even political debates, often invoked as an example of someone the public knew was guilty despite a legal acquittal. The long-term legacy of the trial rests on this divide. On one side, it demonstrated the strength of the American legal system in upholding the principle that guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. On the other, it highlighted the deep dissatisfaction of a public that saw a mother's inconsistent lies, her documented partying during her child's disappearance, and her family's fractured accounts as circumstantial proof of guilt. That tension has not resolved. By the 2020s, the Anthony case was remembered less as a closed criminal file and more as a defining story of early 21st century true crime. Its legacy endures in law, in media, and in collective memory, as much about the questions it left unanswered as the facts it established. At the center of it all remains Caylee Anthony. While debates over her mother's culpability continue, Caylee's short life became the anchor for reforms, remembrance, and a cautionary tale that no amount of media spectacle can eclipse. Years have passed since the verdict was read, but the questions remain. How could a child vanish for 31 days without anyone outside her family knowing? How did a case with so many lies, so much suspicion, and so much emotion end in acquittal? And what does it say about justice when a jury, bound by law, reached a decision the public could never accept? The legacy of this case is not only the trial, the laws it inspired, or the endless debates. It is Caylee Anthony herself, a little girl whose brief life changed the way a nation thought about justice, truth, and accountability. Her story remains one of the most haunting reminders of how easily innocence can be lost and how bitterly justice can be contested. This was the Caylee Anthony case, a story that will never truly fade, no matter how much time passes. On Eternal Obsidian, the echoes of cases like these linger, not as verdicts or conclusions, but as reminders of the questions that history never fully answers.